Good afternoon, students. Today is Sunday, 7 March 2021. This is our second lecture for this past week. Sorry it's a little bit late. Next week we will discuss an essay by Ra'anan Gillen, and that's how you pronounce his name, Ra'anan. He wrote an article many years ago about medical ethics, about principles of medical ethics. It's among the best I've seen. It's short, it's to the point, and he covers the ground that I want to cover. So we'll discuss his essay on both lectures next week. Today, however, I want to discuss a very early work of medical ethics, and that is by the Greek physician Hippocrates. Now, I've already posted on Canvas an excerpt from his works. Here's my copy of it. The excerpt itself is quite short. It's called Oath, and it's only about a page and a half. And there's a Greek translation in case you're conversant in Greek, which I am not. So that's the reading for today. If you haven't read the Oath yet, please stop the video, go read the Oath. It won't take long, and then come back and watch my video, and I'll try to make sense of it for you as we go along today. Okay, now I always like to begin with some images that I've collected of Hippocrates over the years while teaching this oath. I got these images from a Google image search, and I printed them out at home on glossy paper, colored. So let me see whether you can see these. If we were in a classroom, I would pass these around. This is Hippocrates here, a bust. This image, if you can see it there, it shows Hippocrates wearing the green toga or apparel, and you may notice that there's a man holding a snake there. And what Hippocrates is doing in that image is he's warning against the use of serpents in medical treatment. Believe it or not, serpents were widely used. They were thought to be an effective treatment or therapy. And Hippocrates, who's often called the first scientific doctor, thought that was so much superstition, and he tried to get people to stop using serpents in their medical practice. Here's a nice image, very beautiful. It's a painting, obviously, from much after the fact, but it shows Hippocrates ministering to a young boy, maybe a teenager, and the boy's mother is holding his hand and is obviously very concerned for his well-being. So Hippocrates is one of the great physicians in history, and that's why we're talking about him today. Hippocrates was born in the Aegean Sea on a little island called Kos, which I've seen spelled K-O-S and C-O-S. Now this is a printout of a Google map, and you can see there that off the coast of what is now Turkey, and a little bit, and not far from the Greek islands and from Greece, you can see there's a little island. See that red thing in the middle? That identifies the island of Kos, and that's where Hippocrates was born and lived at least part of his life. Okay, so he's from that part of the world, the Greek part of the world. In fact, Hippocrates was a contemporary of some very famous philosophers. He was a contemporary of Socrates, which means he lived during the same time as Socrates. He was a contemporary of Plato, who was younger than Socrates. In fact, Plato studied under Socrates for a while. And there's a great historian named Herodotus, who lived at about the same time. So you have two great philosophers, a great historian, and now Hippocrates, a great physician. So what an amazing time and place that must have been. So much greatness came out of that part of the world at that time. Hippocrates lived a fairly long life. He died at about the age of 70. There's an interesting story about his origins. Hippocrates is said to have descended from the gods. Now, I have a little drawing here, which I'd probably put on the board. I'm not going to test you on this. This is just Greek mythology. but it's interesting nonetheless. The Greek god Zeus, Zeus, who was the god of sky and thunder, had as one of his sons Apollo. You may have heard of the god Apollo. Apollo was the god of music, light, and archery. Apollo had a child, a son, named Asclepius. Asclepius was the god of medicine and healing. Now, Asclepius had 3 daughters: Mediterina, who's the symbol of medicine. Mediterina, you can see how her name, Mediterina, has the same root as the word medicine. And so our English word medicine would have derived from Mediterina. The second daughter was named Hygeia. She's the symbol of hygiene and health. You can see the connection between Hygeia, her name, and hygiene. And cleanliness, of course, is part of health, an important part of healthiness. And the third daughter was named Panacea. She is the symbol of all healing. And I'm sure you've heard that word. We say that something is no panacea, meaning it's not a cure for all ills. A panacea is a cure for all ills. Now, I told you a moment ago, Hippocrates is said to have descended from the god Asclepius, who was the god of medicine and healing. And maybe that's because his skills were so awesome. He was an awe-inspiring physician and scientist who revolutionized medicine during his life. One of Hippocrates' aphorisms is interesting. Let me read it to you. He said, "Life is short, and the art," referring to medicine, "long. The occasion fleeting, experience fallacious, and judgment difficult. The physician must not only be prepared to do what is right himself, but also to make the patient, the attendants, and externals cooperate." So there's some inspirational language about the role of a doctor and about the purpose of medicine. Right? Life is short, our experience is fleeting. The doctor's job is to do what is right himself or herself, but also the doctor has responsibilities to others, mainly the patient, but also to attendants, which we might call nurses and other medical aides, and externals, which I assume would be third parties. Today it would include insurance companies, the government, family members, and so on. So the job of a doctor, the role of a doctor is quite extensive. The doctor has a lot to think about and a lot to do. Hippocrates is the first physician whose writings have survived. Some of his writings, probably many of his writings, were lost and will never be retrieved or discovered. But some of them survived. He appears to have traveled widely throughout the Mediterranean, and he did so to supplement his medical training. Some of his medical training would have been done in the clinic and in what we would call a medical school, but he wanted to supplement that by going out into the world and learning what he could about illnesses, injuries, treatments, and so forth. It is said that he helped end an Athenian plague. He used his medical skill and knowledge to end a plague in Athens, Greece. And that was at about the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. So just as Socrates is sometimes said to be the ideal philosopher, the one we look up to even today, Hippocrates was considered, and still is in many quarters, considered to be the ideal physician. Indeed, he's been called the father of medicine, Hippocrates. Now we're going to be looking at the oath of this man, this doctor, Hippocrates. It's called the Hippocratic Oath. The oath has survived and come down to us, fortunately, so we can read it and think about it and interpret it. and ask whether any of its provisions still obtain today. Much has changed. This is 2021 now. We're more than 2.5 millennia away from Hippocrates' life and death. And yet, he still speaks to us in a way. The things, the principles that he laid down are still applicable to doctors today, even though our technology is vastly different from his. The moral or ethical principles are still applicable. And that's part of his greatness, that he was able to cut through the particularities of his time and place and get at these underlying fundamental, timeless ethical principles that still apply and move us today. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what's called the Corpus Hippocraticum, which is Latin for the body of work of Hippocrates and his followers. It's called the Corpus Hippocraticum. And by the way, I posted my lecture notes. Many of you have noticed this already. Some of you may not have. But I posted my lecture notes, the very notes from which I'm reading today and lecturing today. I posted them on Canvas for you. I think this is at least the second time I've done that. I'm pretty sure I posted the lecture notes for Morris versus Brandenburg, that New Mexico court case we discussed. So I'll do that from time to time. I don't mind sharing my notes with you. Maybe it'll inspire you to learn how to make better notes for yourself. After all, I was a student for a long time, just as you now are. I learned how to make notes as a student and as a graduate student and as a law student, and I've continued doing so as a professor. Whenever I read something, especially something that I plan to lecture on, I sit down at my computer and I make notes on it. I create an outline, and that helps structure my thinking. Right? My mind is structured. The way I think is structured by the notes that I have made at the computer. Now, it doesn't have to be a computer. You could write the notes out in longhand, but I find that typing into a computer is at least as quick and probably quicker for me. So I like to use that. And once you make a draft of your notes, you can revise it again and again very quickly and easily on a computer. Whereas if you had written it out, you would have things crossed out and written in above them. You'd have things written in the margin. It would be quite messy after a while. So I'm constantly updating and modifying my notes as the years go by, if I continue to use a particular article. And I have used this one a few times. Okay, now most of the writings that are called Corpus Hippocraticum today, there are about 70 different writings. Most of them were probably not written by Hippocrates himself, but rather his school or guild. So back in Hippocrates' day, there were what we might call rival medical schools or guilds. The word guild is spelled G-U-I-L-D. You may have heard of the Screenwriters Guild in Southern California. A guild is a group of like-minded people who are bound by a common interest and a common set of objectives and methods. So there were medical guilds back in Hippocrates' day, and they had different approaches to medicine. And so in that sense, they were rivals of one another. In fact, don't we have that today? We have doctors who receive a Doctor of Medicine degree, or MD, and we have doctors who receive a degree of DO. So we have, if you choose to go to medical school, you'll have to decide whether to go pursue an MD degree or a DO degree. You could think of those as rival schools, and they do tend to have a different approach to medicine. One school might emphasize surgery as opposed to another school. One school may emphasize drug therapy rather than surgery, and so on. So the methods, the techniques that are learned may differ depending on the sort of medicine you go into. And that was true back in ancient Greece as well. So, what was the purpose of all of these Hippocratic writings that have come down to us, the 70 or so writings? According to the editor of this, you'll notice that this work by Hippocrates that has come down to us is edited by W.H.S. Jones. So he's an expert on Hippocrates and on the life and times of Hippocrates. So I'm going to quote Jones here and there today, and it's from that excerpt that I posted on Canvas for you. Jones says that the Hippocratic writings that have come down to us over time were, quote, intended to instruct medical students or practitioners, unquote. Okay, so there was a pedagogical purpose to them. What I mean by that is it was a teaching purpose. These were teaching documents. And the students who were supposed to be taught were medical students who would one day become physicians themselves, and also doctors who were already practicing medicine. We'll call those practitioners. Now, what was the main contribution that Hippocrates made to medicine? I told you that he was a pioneer, an originator. Here is a quotation from R.J. Hankinson, who wrote the entry on Hippocrates for the online Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So listen to a little bit of Hankinson. He says, on the biomedical methodology side, these writings, meaning the Hippocratic writings, provide the most detailed biomedical observations to date in the Western world. So the observations that were recorded and that have come down to us over the millennia were very detailed observations. On the ethical side, as opposed to the medical side, their code of professional ethics is so well structured that it continues to stand as a model for other professions like law or engineering. Okay? And here is a longer quotation from Hankinson. Now listen carefully, because he's going to describe, and you could read along with this in my notes if you printed them out. Hankinson is going to describe the originality of Hippocrates and how he revolutionized medicine. He says, the main innovation of the Hippocratic authors, which presumably includes Hippocrates himself, seems to have lain in their desire for systematicity. Notice the word system in there, systematicity. And he points out the corpus contains several evidently incompatible systems. But there was a concern for system or systematicity. And the related drives toward diagnostic precision, prognostic knowledge, and nosological explanation. Well, let's talk about those a little bit, and then we'll move on from there. Diagnostic precision. Hippocrates emphasized diagnosis and being precise. If someone presents to you, a patient presents to you with a particular illness or injury or ailment, the doctor's first task is to diagnose it. And that's going to require a vast knowledge and a vast experience, right? So a new doctor might not be able to diagnose the disease. It may have to consult with more experienced doctors. A wiser, more experienced doctor may, after having examined the patient carefully and talked to the patient and gotten a list of all the symptoms, that doctor, drawing upon his or her experience, may zoom in on the disease. And then, of course, the doctor would conduct tests to confirm that that disease is really present. So being precise in your diagnosis was a key factor for Hippocrates and his followers. Secondly, prognostic knowledge. Here, the goal is to be able to predict the course of the disease or injury over time, right? To know from experience what will happen if A, we do nothing to treat it, B, we do a particular form of treatment, C, we do some other kind of treatment, maybe D, E, F, and so on. So we want to be able to forecast what will happen depending on what we do. That's called prognostic knowledge. And finally, nosological explanation. The word nosological comes from nosology, Nosology, and it has to do with classification of diseases. So Hippocrates wanted to classify and name all the diseases that afflicted humanity. It would be kind of an encyclopedia that could be passed on from generation to generation of doctors. So Hippocrates was very methodical, very organized, and he was obviously benevolent in that he wanted to help people. So he thought the best way to help people, if you're a physician, is to contribute to a growing body of information and diagnostic techniques and explanations. Get it all written down, pass it on, make sure you teach your students everything that's then known so that they can become good doctors and that they could contribute to the knowledge and pass it on even further. So to continue with Hankinson, he said, for the Hippocratics, medicine is about understanding the nature of health and disease, and the measures needed to maintain the former and cure the latter. And they are fundamentally physical phenomena to be approached from a physical point of view. So Hippocrates wanted to strip away all of the occult beliefs that surrounded medicine, all of the superstitions like using serpents to treat various illnesses. He was the first scientifically minded physician. He wanted to put medicine, remember, medicine is not a science. Medicine is an art or profession that is founded or that rests on science. So science is the basis of medicine. We can think of it as scientific medicine. And Hippocrates could be said to be the founder of that, of the scientific foundation of medical practice. Let's talk about the oath now. I've given you some information about Hippocrates, the person, and his life and times. We've talked about the writings, the Corpus Hippocraticum that has come down to us, and what they emphasize and discuss. Let's talk now about the oath specifically, the oath that doctors are to take, or prospective doctors. Jones, the editor of this work by Hippocrates, Jones describes the Hippocratic Oath as, quote, a landmark in the ethics of medicine. A landmark. Okay, it was original. It was fundamental. Nothing like this had, so far as we know, had ever been written or propounded or put out there. And it was a new thing. The whole idea that a doctor would take an oath. Remember, an oath is a type of commitment. So when you take this oath, you are committing yourself to certain principles or practices, right? And presumably, if you violate that commitment, you would experience guilt and remorse, and you may even fall in for criticism from others who take the oath seriously. You could be censured by a medical organization to which you belong, or the state. The government itself may take an interest in medical practice and may regulate doctors and hold them to their commitments, their oaths. Jones points out that little is known about the author of the oath specifically. It may have been Hippocrates himself. It may have been one of his followers. We don't know exactly what the purpose of the oath was, although we can guess. We don't know how it was used and we don't know the date of composition. We don't know whether it was written during Hippocrates' lifetime or afterward, after he died. And if it was after, we don't know how long after. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding this oath. Jones says that some scholars regard the oath as the test required by the Asclepiad Guild. Remember, Hippocrates was said to have descended from the god Asclepius, who's the god of medicine and healing. And so they called their guild the Asclepiad Guild. And some scholars, according to Jones, regard the oath as the test required by that guild. We might call it the Hippocratic Guild, although it's described here as the Asclepiad Guild. Jones says there's no support, unfortunately, for that contention. So that's really just speculation, right? It's unconfirmed, uncorroborated. Jones writes on page 296 that, quote, "We may suppose that no respectable physician would act contrary to most of the oath, even if he were ignorant of its existence." Now, that's interesting because Jones is suggesting that what's set forward in the oath is probably, in large part, common sense and common knowledge. Right? It was absorbed by people in their training. And so people just ended up following the oath even if they hadn't actually read it in written form. And finally, on that same page, Jones writes, "Here, in this oath, we have committed to writing those noble rules, loyal obedience to which has raised the calling of a physician to be the highest of all the professions." So it was an exalted status in Hippocrates' day to be a physician. And it was largely because of his work in changing the practice of medicine that gave it that exalted status, right? He, by putting it on a scientific footing and by requiring an oath of medical practitioners, he helped make it a noble profession, a noble calling. So I suspect that every medical practitioner today, and you can check up on this if you'd like. Maybe you yourself are a medical practitioner. Some of you, I think, are majoring in nursing. And so I assume that maybe you are already working in a medical setting, a hospital, for example, or a clinic. Just ask some of the people you work with, have you ever heard of the Hippocratic Oath? And I suspect that you'll get a 100% affirmative answer. The person will say, of course, everybody in medicine knows about the Hippocratic Oath. And we all take it seriously as well. Right? It has some important ethical principles to which we're expected to conform or at least aspire. So, what I propose to do in the remainder of today is read the oath sentence by sentence, and I'll make comments on each of the sentences when I'm done with them. So you can follow along. If we were in a classroom, of course, you could raise questions and we could have some interaction. That's usually how it goes, but we're bound by this technology. It's kind of a one-way flow of information. But I may anticipate a question or two here based upon my prior teaching. I'm trying to guess what kinds of questions you might have, and I'll raise them myself. So here we go. The first sentence of the oath says, "I swear by Apollo, physician, by Asclepius, by health, by panacea, and by all the gods and goddesses, making them my witnesses, that I will carry out, according to my ability and judgment, this oath and this indenture." Now, look at all the personages who are mentioned in this. I'm going to go back to my little handout where I have a genealogy of the gods here. First of all, I swear by Apollo, physician. Apollo was the father of the god Asclepius, who was the father of medicine, the god of medicine and healing. Okay? So the father of Asclepius is mentioned in this oath, and then Asclepius by name is mentioned, and then two of the three daughters. Health clearly refers to Hygeia, who is the symbol of hygiene and health. So the name Hygeia isn't mentioned, but she is symbolic of health. So the word health is mentioned. And the third daughter is Panacea, the third one I mentioned, and she's mentioned by name in the oath as well. I don't know why Metatrina was left out, the third daughter, but she was. Now, what is an oath? An oath, as I said earlier, is a form of commitment. It's along the same lines as a promise, a vow, a resolution, an agreement of some sort. So this oath is meant to be taken seriously by those who take it and by those who observe it. Right? If you take an oath and I know that you've taken that oath, I'm going to hold you to it. And I expect you to comply with it. Otherwise, your oath was insincere. You didn't really take it seriously. Maybe you didn't at the time you took the oath. Right? You just mouthed the words instead of intending to conform your behavior to them. Now, notice it says in here, it's an oath and an indenture. An indenture is a legally binding agreement to serve as an apprentice or servant. So the first sentence ends as follows: I will carry out, according to my ability and judgment, this oath and this indenture. So when you become a doctor, you are serving an apprenticeship while you're training and learning. And you are, in effect, entering into a binding agreement when you undertake the study of medicine. Right? You are, in effect, an apprentice or a servant of medicine and of those who are teaching you. Right? Back in the old days, before there were colleges, people learned things like law by serving as an apprentice. I believe Thomas Jefferson learned law in this way. Thomas Jefferson was, by the time he reached adulthood, he was a lawyer or attorney, but he never went to a law school to study law in any formal way. What he did was he served as an apprentice to a practicing lawyer. It may have been George Mason or someone equally famous in Virginia. I believe that's how Abraham Lincoln learned law. He was a practicing lawyer, but I'm pretty sure Lincoln never set foot in any college or university, much less a law school, or what we would now call a law school. So serving an apprenticeship was the old-fashioned way of learning a trade or a craft or a profession. So transport yourself back to the Greek world. There were no formal medical schools such as we have now. There were guilds, there were practicing doctors or physicians, and you would try to become an apprentice to one of them. And when you did so, you would take an indenture, or you would make an indenture. That meant you're agreeing in a binding way to serve that doctor as a servant and apprentice, in the hope of one day learning enough that you could become a physician of your own. Okay, the second sentence goes like this. Now, this is something you are taking an oath to do. To hold my teacher in this art equal to my own parents, to make him partner in my livelihood, when he is in need of money, to share mine with him, to consider his family as my own brothers, and to teach them this art if they want to learn it without fee or indenture, to impart precept, oral instruction, and all other instruction to my own sons, the sons of my teacher, and to indentured pupils who have taken the physician's oath, but to nobody else. Wow, that last part is kind of creepy, isn't it? I will teach only certain people and no others. It makes it sound like a cult, doesn't it? This guild system has a cultish quality to it. So it's us against them, right? Us represents the members of the guild, and we take care of each other. We educate each other's children. In this case, they call them sons, because I'm sure only males were allowed to study and practice medicine at the time. So we will take care of each other, the brotherhood of doctors. We will educate each other for free. Should any of us fall on hard times, he will be taken care of by the other members of the guild. So there's a cult or guild quality to this second sentence. By the way, I mentioned the word precept. It says to impart precept. A precept is simply a written rule of some art or practice. So that's what you're teaching. You're teaching rules of medicine, of how to diagnose, give prognoses, things like that. Okay, third sentence. I will use treatment to help the sick according to my ability and judgment, but never with a view to injury and wrongdoing. Now, even in that one sentence, there are two very important principles being expressed. And when we get to the essay by Ra'anan Gillen next week, you'll see that he separates these two principles. The first one is called the principle of beneficence, which is good doing. Beneficence means doing good for others. And the second principle is called non-maleficence. And you can probably guess what that word maleficence means. It means doing bad or ill or evil even. So these two principles say do good and refrain from doing bad. And those are different, right? It's one thing to go out into the world and do good for people, and that's required of a physician. It's another thing not to harm people. Right? Doing good for people means lifting them up above their baseline. Right? So if a patient presents to you at this level of health, your job as a doctor is to improve that patient's health or well-being. Right? So it's up only. Non-maleficence means if the patient shows up here, you must not do anything that lowers the patient's health or well-being. So there's a saying in medicine, first, do no harm. And what that means is, most importantly, don't make things worse. And then if you can, make them better. So a doctor has a twofold obligation, and it's incorporated here in the Hippocratic Oath. Whatever else you do, don't make things worse. Use your knowledge and skill to make things better, but never make things worse. Because then the patient would have been better off not even coming to see you if you end up making things worse. So there's the Latin term for this. It's called primum non nocere. Let me spell it for you. Primum is Primum. It means first, right? Primary, prime. Non means not, N-O-N. And nocere, N-O-C-E-R-E, means roughly harm. So primum non nocere is a famous Latin expression that means first, do no harm. And that word first could be replaced by most importantly, do no harm. That's your first duty as a doctor. Don't harm anyone. Don't make anyone worse off. And then, once you've satisfied that, do all you can to benefit or do good for your patients and others. Now, I found a quotation a while back from Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale was a famous nurse. I believe she was a nurse during the Civil War. I may have her confused with Clara Barton. I'm sorry if I do. But Florence Nightingale was a famous nurse. And according to a logic book that I read, here's a quotation. Florence Nightingale transformed modern hospital practice by the motto, whatever hospitals do, they should not spread disease. That's similar to primum non nocere, isn't it? The purpose of a hospital is to get people well again, to keep people alive and improve their health so that they can be released from the hospital to live their lives in happiness. Wouldn't it be ironic, at the least ironic, if someone went to the hospital for treatment and ended up contracting a disease while there? So Florence Nightingale is trying to caution against that. She's saying we in these hospitals must be careful not to spread disease. We're here to cure diseases and make people well. And at a minimum, we must not make anybody sick while he or she is in the hospital. Okay, next sentence. The oath says, neither will I administer a poison to anybody when asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a course. So there are two things you must not do: administer a poison, and secondly, suggest such a course of action. Right? Recommend it, prescribe it. Now, you can see that this has a bearing on the case we just discussed out of New Mexico. It appears that this prohibits two things: euthanasia, where the physician brings about the death of a patient for his or her own good, a kind of mercy killing, and physician-assisted suicide, or what the plaintiffs in that Morris case called aid in dying. Once again, read this and ask yourself whether it covers aid in dying. Neither will I administer a poison to anybody when asked to do so. Think of the lethal injection being prescribed. Nor will I suggest such a course. So you don't even mention it to your patients. You don't say, by the way, there are certain drugs that you could take that would end your life painlessly. Right? You don't even suggest such a thing if you're a doctor, according to this oath. Now, the American Medical Association, if you look at the final page of my lecture notes, I have a little chart. The AMA is the American Medical Association, which is the largest, I believe, the largest association of doctors in the United States today. Not every doctor is a member. And I've seen recently that the percentage of doctors who are members of the AMA is steadily declining. I think it's now less than 20% of the doctors in the United States are members of the AMA. But it's still a very powerful organization and a very wealthy organization, and they have a lot of clout. So everyone pays attention to their ethical rulings and judgments. The American Medical Association, if you look at the chart I have on the final page, does not allow either active euthanasia, where the physician kills a patient for his or her own good out of mercy, and the AMA also disallows physician-assisted suicide. Now, the AMA's Code of Ethics has no legal effect. Right? It has no power to prosecute doctors. These are ethical guidelines designed to guide doctors, but they have no enforcement power. Although I suppose they could censure you or even kick you out of the AMA if you violated its guidelines, its ethical guidelines. Okay, next sentence. It says, similarly, I will not give to a woman a pessary to cause abortion. Now, a pessary is an implement. It's a medical device inserted into the vagina. And I suppose there could be various purposes for doing so. So what this says is I will not give to a woman a pessary. I will not insert anything into her vagina for the purposes of causing an abortion. Meaning, I suppose, the termination of the life of the fetus or embryo or baby, whatever you want to call it, that's developing in her uterus, in her womb. So that looks like a pretty clear prohibition, ethical prohibition on abortion. physician participation in abortion. Now, here's the American Medical Association position on abortion. I'm going to read it to you. It's opinion 2.01, abortion. It says, the principles of medical ethics of the AMA do not prohibit a physician from performing an abortion in accordance with good medical practice and under circumstances that do not violate the law. So the AMA position is that a physician who's a member of the AMA may, if he or she chooses to do so, may perform an abortion as long as it's in accordance with good medical practice and doesn't violate any laws or legal provisions. So the AMA allows doctors to perform abortions. Hippocrates, according to this oath, appears to exclude it or prohibit it. So there you have a divergence between the Hippocratic Oath and the AMA. Okay? Next, but I will keep pure and holy both my life and my art. That's a short sentence. Notice, medicine is continually referred to as an art, not as a science. It's an art, it's a craft, it's a profession. It does rest on science, of course. It's scientific medicine. I suppose you could have a non-scientific type of medicine, but Hippocrates wanted his medical practice to rest upon the best science of his day. So what this says is, I will keep pure and holy both in my life and in my art, meaning my practice of medicine. And this sounds almost like a monastic vow, doesn't it? People who enter monasteries, people who devote themselves to a monastic life, take vows of chastity and sometimes poverty as well. And by chastity, I don't mean necessarily sex or sexual abstinence, but chastity is broader than that. Chastity means purity, being pure. And you can see why the term chastity has developed a sexual connotation, because one way to be pure is to be sexually pure, to be celibate, to abstain from sex. But there are other ways to be pure. You can be pure in your diet. You can be pure ethically pure in the way you live your life or the way you practice your art. So there's a kind of monastic quality here. Earlier we saw that there was a kind of cultish quality to Hippocratic medicine. Now we're starting to see it's more like a monastery, right? You take a vow of chastity when you become a doctor. The word chaste, C-H-A-S-T-E, which is the word that gives us chastity, the word chaste derives from the Latin word castus, C-A-S-T-U-S, which means morally pure. Okay? And it has come to connote sexual purity, but it was not limited in that way originally. Okay, we're down to about 4 more sentences and we'll be done. The next sentence is this: I will not use the knife, not even verily on sufferers from stone, comma, but I will give place to such as are craftsmen therein. Now, this is likely to blow your minds. During Hippocrates' day, surgery which is cutting into the body, was considered degrading for a physician. That was beneath the status of a physician. Ooh, cutting? Cutting into a body with a knife? That's mechanical stuff. Doctors are intellectuals, right? We leave the cutting and the blood spurting, we leave that to mechanics, basically. People who have manual skills, cutting, chopping. So guess who did the surgery, not only in the ancient world, but throughout much of the medieval world? And I'm getting this from my independent research. During medieval times, and by the way, I got this from the history.com website, which I take to be authoritative. During medieval times, it says there, barbers performed surgery, tooth extraction, bone setting, and other medical procedures. Barbers. And if you look into it, my allergist, a woman who is steeped in medical lore and medical history, told me a fascinating story. And when I looked into it, I saw that she's exactly right. I thought she was making it up. The barber pole that you see in front of a barber shop, which has a kind of swirling formation, it's red and white. That barber pole originally signified a barber shop where blood was let, bones set, surgery performed, and various other procedures. So if you've ever wondered, why do barbers have that funny looking red and white pole with the swirling thing on it? It's because of the history of barbering, being a barber. Right? They now cut hair and do other tasks like that, but no barber today does any kind of surgery or bone setting or bloodletting. So isn't it interesting that in this world of Hippocrates, doctors did not descend to the level of actually cutting? Now, a doctor might supervise the surgery and give elaborate, detailed instructions about what to do. Cut this area open, then do this, and then sew it up or whatever. But the doctor did not himself conduct the surgery. And so it says, I will not use the knife, not even on sufferers from stone. Now, I have no idea what that means. Here are some possibilities. It could refer to kidney stones. Maybe kidney stones were cut out with a knife at that time. And maybe they still are. I honestly don't know. It could be gallstones, because those have the word stone in them. It might be, and I think my allergist suggested this when I talked to her about the Hippocratic Oath, it could refer to castration. The stones then would be the gonads. So maybe what this says is physicians will not castrate anyone. They will leave that to barbers, to other craftsmen, which is the word used. Notice I got my little knife here. Carving with a knife. So very interesting paragraph, isn't it? It sheds some light on how doctors understood themselves as intellectuals. They were minds rather than mechanics or menial laborers. They left the dirty work of medicine, the cutting and so forth, to another class of people who weren't trained in medicine. Okay, 3 more. Next sentence. Into whatsoever houses I enter, I will enter to help the sick, and I will abstain from all intentional wrongdoing and harm, especially from abusing the bodies of man or woman, bond or free. There again, you have that important distinction between beneficence or doing good and non-maleficence, which is abstaining from doing harm. Okay, so that same distinction comes back again. And notice you will not, when you go into a house, and this, of course, doctors may well have done house calls back in that time. They rarely do that now, but maybe that was the primary way physicians went to the houses of the sick or injured to minister to them. So it says, went into whatsoever houses I enter. I will help the sick, abstain from intentional wrongdoing and harm, especially from abusing the bodies of man or woman, bond or free. Now remember, there was slavery in the ancient world. So a person who's bonded is someone who's bound, who's a slave, or perhaps an indentured servant. I should point out to you that slavery in the ancient world, in Athens, for example, was not race-based, as it came to be much later in human history, in this country, for example. The slaves were often of the same ethnic stock as the slave owners. It's just that they were from a different city-state and they may have been captured in war. So when you would capture people in a war, you could enslave them, bring them back to your city-state and force them to be your slaves. So this obviously refers to anyone who's being held as a slave. Even slaves may not be abused by physicians, is what that says. Two more. This next one says, and whatsoever I shall see or hear in the course of my profession, as well as outside my profession, in my intercourse with men, if it be what should not be published abroad, I will never divulge, holding such things to be holy secrets. Now, I put the emphasis on the wrong word. I think you can understand it even so. In my intercourse with men, I will never divulge, right? Things that I learn in the practice of my profession or in my general intercourse in society. I will hold such things to be holy secrets. Now, that is the basis of what is called the duty of confidentiality. When a doctor interacts with a patient in a medical setting, any knowledge acquired by the doctor about the patient or the patient's condition, anything said to the doctor is to be held in confidence. It's said to be confidential. That's a solemn part of the oath, even today. Every code of ethics in medicine has, take my word for it, a provision dealing with confidentiality. Would you want your doctor to go out and blab to others, including other doctors or nurses, or out with friends, to tell them what your condition is and who you are? Obviously, you don't want your medical professionals to divulge information like that. It's to be kept secret. It's between you and your doctor. Now, remember, if a patient has a right of confidentiality, you could waive it. W-A-I-V-E, waive, a waiver. Any right can be waived. So if I have a right to remain silent, I may speak. Okay? It's up to me. It's my right. I can either stand on my rights and refuse to speak, or I can waive my right to speak and talk to the police or investigators. So you can waive your right to confidentiality as a patient. In fact, when you go into a doctor's office, you have to fill out all kinds of forms. One of the forms you sign invariably is a consent form. What you do is you consent or waive your right to confidentiality with regard to, for example, your insurance company. The doctor wants your permission to inform your insurance company of what your illness is and what is being done about it. So we routinely waive at least part of our rights to confidentiality. We allow our doctors to talk to the insurance company and maybe even to other doctors who are jointly treating you. Okay, one more sentence and we'll be done. Now, if I carry out this oath and break it not, or don't break it, may I gain forever reputation among all men for my life and for my art. But if I transgress it and forswear myself, may the opposite befall me. So, if you uphold and keep your oath, this is a plea for good reputation among all men. But the opposite should befall me if I transgress it. So a doctor who fails to abide by the principles expressed in this oath should have a bad reputation. In fact, the final sentence says, if I don't comply with this oath, may I get a bad reputation. I deserve it. It should happen. So a doctor has a self-interested reason as well as a more noble reason to keep this oath, and that is your livelihood depends on it. If you lose your reputation and become known as a doctor who blabs medical secrets, or a doctor who is harming his or her patients, or a doctor who is performing abortions or performing surgery, your reputation should suffer. That's what this says. Notice the implication that medicine is an honorable calling. Its practitioners are honorable people. That may be the single most lasting tribute to Hippocrates, is he transformed medicine into something vulgar and ordinary, into something exalted and honorable. He wanted medicine to be a respectable way of life, a respectable calling, a respectable way of making a living. And this oath is designed to promote all that. Okay, it's a one-day lecture on the Hippocratic Oath. I gave you what I think is the gist of it. I can tell you that on the exam, there will be 2 true-false questions on what I just covered and 3 multiple-choice questions. So a total of 5 questions out of the 40 total on the exam will come from this one day's lecture. And you have now the reading itself together with the editorial introduction, and you have my lecture notes, which I just went over with you, posted on Canvas. So I'm trying to be a good instructor. I'm trying to do my duty and perhaps more. And I hope that you got something out of the lecture, especially if you have a career in medicine somewhere, as a doctor, as a medical assistant, as a nurse, as an administrator in a hospital. And I hope you never forget the lessons that Hippocrates has to teach us. It's an inspirational story, especially the part about him descending from the gods. I kind of like that. All right, have a great day. And I guess the weekend is almost over because I'm doing this lecture a little bit late. But have a great day and a great remainder of the weekend. There will be 2 lectures next week. And then guess what? We're off on spring break, and that'll be fun for all of us. So 2 more lectures. Please, I'm going to post the reading by Ra'anan Gillen, and it will be posted probably today. I'll try to get it up today, and you can start reading it. Please read at least half of it for the first lecture next week and the other half before the second lecture. All right, see you next week.